Good morning, everybody. It's 296 days until Christmas 2020, and we had to reset the counter again to 0 days since the Star Wars fandom has entered into a new controversy. So, yesterday, I was watching the John Campea show, and he went into an epic tirade about the upcoming Rise of Skywalker novel and some of the early release information that's kind of snuck out there. And then subsequently, I saw like Eckert's Ladder, Thor Skywalker, and much of the fandom menace have kind of jumped into this conversation. So this morning, I wanted to kind of approach it from a different direction and talk about novelizations versus movies, just as a whole. And then we'll break it down into two categories. The first would be novels that were turned into movies, and the second would be movies that were turned into novels. Of course, with Star Wars, it falls more into the latter, where we had screenplays turned into movies, turned into novelizations. But I think it's helpful if we start the conversation around novels that were then turned into screenplays and subsequently movies. So in this case, I wanted to start with an example. An example would be the Harry Potter franchise. Most of us first got to know Harry Potter through the novels. And maybe I shouldn't say most of us, but the novels did precede the movies by several years. So for a great deal of us, that's how we were introduced to it. And there are elements in novels that just simply don't make it into movies. We see this consistently through popular novels, be it Harry Potter or even the dinosaur movies. I just went blank on it. So there's all kinds of novels that have come in. Jurassic Park, sorry about that. So Jurassic Park novels are another where I was first introduced to the movies, but then went and got the novels afterwards because my daughter was interested. She was just obsessed with dinosaurs. So bought her the novels. She enjoyed those. I enjoyed reading it. And I found out that in the novelizations of the Jurassic Park, there's a lot of content in there that just didn't make it to the movies. The movies itself stood on its own, and it's what kind of preempted or kind of spurred this notion within me to go read the novel. The other way was with Harry Potter. The novels kind of inspired me to see the movies because I'm such a fan of the novels. But I wanted to bring up a specific example of something that was in the novels that was critical to the storyline that didn't make it into the movies and caused some disruption in the fandom. And one of the examples from Harry Potter, and there's plenty to draw from, but one of the examples in Harry Potter was an organization called Spew. And if you've only watched the movies and you didn't read the novels at all, the chances are you've never heard of Spew. You have no idea what I'm talking about. It's an organization or a movement that Hermione Granger tried to get started, and it stood for it's an acronym, SPEW, Spew, the Society for the Promotion of Elvish Welfare. Hermione finds out that at Hogwarts they use house elves to make the food and to clean the rooms and to maintain the facility. That these house elves are actually a primary part of Hogwarts, but it's kind of hidden. And of course, we saw how Dobby, the house elf, was treated, and that's kind of how she got involved with wanting to liberate the house elves from service there at Hogwarts. And indeed, at Hogwarts, those house elves are in service. So they're tied to that service the same way that Dobby was tied to his service. Uh, so Hermione starts this organization. She names it Spew. Everybody makes fun of her, but she wants to liberate these elves. And there's all kinds of issues that happen. Dobby ends up getting in as part of the house elves there at Hogwarts, and there's other characters that come in. But as these play out through the books, we get to a point where in the final confrontation, that movement that Hermione started with Spew kind of plays into why the house elves and the elves as general get behind that battle. Certainly, a lot of it had to do with Harry's involvement with Dobby and how uh, he treated Dobby with such respect when Dobby died, but that wasn't the whole story. And the house elves had a lot to do with it. We see the same thing with uh, in Goblet of Fire. Um, the house elves, Dobby, helped a great deal with Harry solving some of the problems. And in the movies, that got all transitioned. The involvement of Dobby got transitioned to Neville Longbottom. So we had not only the story arc impacted by the movie from the novelizations, but we had character arcs, entire character arcs affected by the movie adaptations of these books. So often we end up with a little incongruity, right, between a novel and its movie. Now, that happens frequently with novels that are turned into movies, and the same. And sometimes that's really noticeable, like I mentioned with Harry Potter. In other cases, it's less so, like with the Jurassic Park. In the Jurassic Park novels, there's a good bit of involvement of the T-Rex that doesn't make it into the movie. There's a whole scene that I truly enjoyed in the novels where they end up behind a waterfall and the T-Rex is chasing them, and it was a fantastic scene as it reads out in the novel. It didn't make it into the movie at all, and so in that case, it just adds some more context, contextualization, and enriches the story. It doesn't really change the story arc or necessarily the character arcs, but it does enrich the story. Now, some of the subsequent Jurassic Park movies deviated greatly from the books, and so much so that they almost don't resemble the book at all. So, in those cases, if you're coming from a novel to a movie, most of us have come to expect that the movies are going to butcher the thing that you love. And they get a lot of criticism from the fandoms, but the general movie going audience isn't involved in this internal combat that goes on between the fandom and what's going on. And in fact, most of the fandom is in general agreement. Like the novels are way better than the movies, and they'll in general agreement about the things that distract from the movies that they really wish would be in there. And you end up with them with a kind of a unified fandom that just loves talking about their franchise. So in Star Wars, we have had the other direction. The movies are not inspired by the novelizations. When in every case that we have so far with Star Wars, the movies then inspire the novels with all of the, we'll just say with the major the saga, right? The Skywalker saga. All of those novelizations are built from the movie content, and the movies are built from screenplays. And if you were to go back and read the screenplay, and I know there's a popular screenplay that's kind of making its way through the Star Wars fandom and different takes on it and there's arguments among the fandom saying, oh, we wish we would have had this screenplay instead of what we got in the Rise of Skywalker. But the truth of it is, screenplays don't even make it into the movies intact. So just as we have between a novel and the movies, screenplays to movies don't stay intact either. And that happens for a number of reasons. Some of them are because the movie has to go through reshoots. As they start to look at the pacing of the movie, the storytelling of the movie, there's scenes that get kind of rewritten as they go. And then ultimately, sometimes they'll go and do a reshoot because they realize they need to cut an entire scene. But without that scene, there's no context for something that comes after. So what they do is they change the story, add a piece to one scene so they could cut out another entire scene, just to help with the pacing of the movie and make it move along better. With the Rise of Skywalker now, some of the controversy has existed over two things that have kind of leaked out from the fandom. And it came from the C2E2 event in Chicago. There's some early releases of the novel. Santa hasn't had an opportunity yet, so I haven't had the opportunity yet to read that. I didn't attend C2E2, and I don't have an early copy in my possession. Plus, I've been consuming these novels via audiobook through public library system and listening to the novelizations for free using the public library app. So it'll be some time before I get to read or listen to the entire Rise of Skywalker novelization. But what we have seen in those releases, there's some photos of pages that people have released, have caused this argument between the fandom to happen again. And the first one has to do with Palpatine. So Palpatine is revealed in the novel to be inhabiting a cloned body. So what we see in The Rise of Skywalker when we see Palpatine is, in the novelization, a cloned version. So now it's raised, well, we didn't get that in the definition book that came out. We didn't get that in the movie. There's nothing from the movie or the prior content that's been released that would give us any indication that Palpatine was in a cloned body. And this has then caused people to kind of get stirred up and argumentative, right? Like, what is going on? The movie didn't say any of this. We had this other release, and the story group has told us that everything is supposed to tie together. We're supposed to have one seamless story. And what we have now are almost 3 different versions of the same event. And it's riled people up. And like I mentioned earlier, John Campea went on an epic tirade yesterday, just losing his mind over it. And if you were interested in going to see that, it's available. It's from March 2nd, 2020. And you can see what John went off regarding the story group and this continuity. So it all boils back to continuity. And as I mentioned before, when we go from novelization to movie, the fandom kind of still gets this stir, but most of them agree that the novel support is far better than the movie. And the movies have to drop stuff. But when we go from movie to novel, and the novel adds so much more, the interpretation of fandom, the fandom as a whole, and within Star Wars community, within the Star Wars fandom, there's already a divide, and what it does is just drive another wedge into there, and it's unfortunate. Right? It's unfortunate that the fandom itself is at odds with one another over how we should interpret these things, and just how angry we should be at the story group for the decisions that they make. So just to flesh that out a little more fully, the argument goes that through this sequel trilogy, the Lucasfilm Story Group did not have a firmly established storyline, and particularly as it relates to Palpatine. Um, there's disagreement over whether Palpatine was even part of the plan for the movies, or if they just pulled it out of the hat for the Rise of Skywalker, and he was never part of the plan until then. Um, I fall on the side that says there was a plan for Palpatine. You can see allusions to it in some uh, foreshadowing of it in the Aftermath books. It's there, and you could pick up on that stream. But what you don't see is it played out very well through the movies. And let me just address them individually. Through the Force Awakens, in the novelization of the Force Awakens, there are some very small evidences that Palpatine was perhaps part of that plan. And again, it doesn't necessarily reveal that Palpatine was there, but looking back, once we have the full story unfolded, we can look back and we can see there's some things that Palpatine or that Snoke said to Kylo that are very particular, and those particular things had to do with what happened between Vader and Luke and the Emperor in the Death Star. So how did Snoke become aware of those particulars, right? So there were all kinds of fan theories about it and some conjecture about it. I know Star Wars Theory came out with a thing about it. That was one of his very first things, but when he started growing his channel, and the thought was, well, Palpatine's in there, right? That Snoke is actually a clone of Palpatine. He is Palpatine. Turns out that wasn't the case, but looking back, you can see that there was some Palpatine influence there. So again, that's a thread. It's a clue. It's something a seed that was planted. If we then go on to The Last Jedi to see, do we have any evidences now looking back that says that Palpatine was evolved, or that maybe Snoke was a clone, or that maybe Palpatine was alive? Anything. And from what I can recall through the movie and in the novelization, there's nothing that would give you that indication. So even though I believe the Lucasfilm Story Group had a plan to have Palpatine there, it wasn't executed in The Last Jedi. And that's where the criticism comes in, is that there wasn't a really strong storyline that was developed. There wasn't a strong through line that said, here are some points that need to be addressed as the story unfolds. They knew where they wanted to end, and they knew, as far as Palpatine is concerned, right, to just talk about this subject, it seemed that JJ introduced it, sufficiently, I would say, in the Force Awakens, but that it was not followed up then by Rian Johnson in The Last Jedi, and that through line didn't exist. And when Snoke was killed, we weren't given any evidence that he was part of that plan. So, looking back, the story group should have put some contextual evidence. They don't necessarily have to have a giveaway, or they don't necessarily have to spell it out for us. But just as in the Force Awakens and in Aftermath, where there were some clues, if you will, or there were some foreshadowing, we didn't have that in The Last Jedi, in the movie, nor in the novelization. And so now when we get to The Rise of Skywalker and everything's revealed, the movie then presents us a version of it. And again, we talk about, within a novelization, you can add more context, you can add more detail. There are thoughts that are shared. There are more of the story that can be fleshed out. And in that perspective, then the novels always, and even when we go from movie to novel, have more information in it. The question is, does the Rise of Skywalker retcon? And but retcon, we mean retroactive context, right? So there's contextualization that happens retroactively. And it's within the fandom, it appears to me anyway, that when somebody says retcon, it has a different kind of connotation. That connotation is that it changes something, right? Not that it retroactively gives context or contextually gives us information retroactively, but that it actually undoes or overlays what was previously given to us with something different. And that's not the case of a retcon. A retcon is an example where Darth Vader was originally not supposed to be Luke Skywalker's father. In A New Hope, and even when we get into uh, uh, the Empire Strikes Back, in the original screenplays, again, we mentioned screenplays to movies don't necessarily line up, but in those original screenplays to A New Hope and then followed by The Empire Strikes Back, Darth Vader was not his father. And there's a specific scene in Empire Strikes Back where in the screenplay where Anakin talks to Luke, and Anakin is a different person than he's already in the Force. He's already a Force ghost, and he's talking to Luke from a Force ghost, father to son, and how proud of his son he is, and that Vader is still alive. Vader is a separate entity, but that was retconned, right? What we see in the movies was retconned when they decided to make Darth Vader his father. So it's a retroactive contextualization that then they had to explain with this from a certain point of view line that lines up in The Empire Strikes Back. So when they say, well, from a certain point of view, this is the case. So so that's always existed within Star Wars. There's always been these retcons from the prequels to the original, and then now in the sequels, there's been this retroactive, after the fact, contextualization that gives us more information that changes our perspective of what it is that we've already seen. It doesn't change what we've already seen. It gives us different perspective on what we've seen. And so it gives us that from a certain point of view kind of approach. The question is, with the Rise of Skywalker novelization, does it do the other, right? Does it actually change? So what we saw in the movie isn't what happened, or what we saw in the additional texts that have come out. That's not what happened. Does it actually make that stuff false? Does it make it incorrect so that the movie or the other text is not correct? So more of what we get from the Harry Potter, where attributes of Dobby are given to Neville Longbottom, does it actually change what was in the book, or or in the movie, to one way or the other? So does the Rise of Skywalker novelization change, undo, or make what you see in the movie not the fact? And I would argue that we don't know enough yet to say that. Certainly, John Campea believes that it's a hot mess, and his tirade goes along that line. Eckhart's Ladder tried to reconcile some of it, but it was kind of from a negative perspective that says it doesn't make sense, right? And I would just caution that we don't go full negative yet, right? Don't go like this changes the movie, or that it doesn't make sense. Give it time. Let's find out what the full novel says, and then allow it to play out. And then not only that, but as we had with the prequels, where the prequels made a hot mess of a lot of things from my perspective. But over the years since then, we've had additional information that retroactively gave us context. It retconned a lot of the information, right? It gave us context. It didn't undo anything from the prequels, but it gave it additional context that allows us to make it fit together more nicely. And what I suspect will end up here with the Rise of Skywalker novelization is it's going to give us some retroactive continuity. It's going to give us some retroactive context that gives us a different perspective. But then over time, there'll be additional information that that fills in the holes more nicely. So, Stories by Irish. Hey, welcome. It's great to have you here. And just reading your comment, the difference is they're coming with the book after. Yeah, so that's what I mentioned. Like, it's one thing when you're going from novel to movie. It's different when you're going from movie back to novel. And when the other point is that the Lucasfilm Story Group has told us that everything released should fit together, right? So even though the novels give you additional information, and I would argue that's okay, right? That's okay that the novels give you additional information. In fact, it should be expected that novels are going to give you additional information. But what the novels can't do, or what they shouldn't do, according to Lucasfilm's own rules, is it shouldn't contradict. So when you say that it retcons something, does it contradict what came before, or does it just change the perspective that from a certain point of view kind of thing? And that's really what we're addressing here. And nobody, at least some people do have the novels. They got them at C2E2. I haven't, and from what I've read or what I've listened to from John Campea, or from Eckhart's Ladder, or Thor Skywalker, or from the Fandom Menace, none of those folks have read the books yet, and so we don't have the full story. We don't know yet the full of it, and does it contradict or not? Early thought is that yes, it's contradicting, and that's raised a lot of ire between the fandom. It's gotten people really upset to say, you promised us something, you're delivering us something else. And our expectation is higher than what you're giving us. And to some degree, I think it's fair. I think that now that we see the whole thing unfolded, that it's clear that the story group did not have enough meat on the bones. It's one thing to say that we had the bones in place and we allow the directors to put to flesh it out, and that's normal. But it seems that there wasn't a firm plan in place that said, here's the skeleton, right, for each of the movies. Now you flesh each of the movies out. It was more of just a thin line, and I put it in that context. Like, it seemed to me that the story group gave them a thin line and said, okay, here's your line. Now you add anything to it you want. And they let them build the whole skeleton. They let them build the whole body off of that thin line. And then what was left out from one movie to another didn't give us that through point that most people wanted. I'm generally a fan of the sequel trilogy. I've enjoyed the sequel trilogy. I enjoyed all three movies. But The Force Awakens was my favorite. The Last Jedi comes in the middle, and The Rise of Skywalker comes in last. That's for me, right? For me. I know people that put The Rise of Skywalker as the very top one for the sequel trilogy, and that's great. Each person can interpret them as they will, but what we need is the fandom to say, you know what, Lucasfilm, we want better, right? We want a stronger through line, something that makes sense when you watch the sequel trilogy as a whole for everybody, not just for people that are working to make it make sense, but for anybody that just is a casual fan that comes along and watches it. My complaint is that people like, again, John Campea's rant yesterday, or the Fandom Menace specifically, are actually doing damage. So they're coming in and they're tearing apart. And we saw recently some of the author, or there was a tweet yesterday, I think, where the authors were saying there's an impact to the authors, to the writers, because of the negativity that comes through and where people are being attacked. And then I saw some backlash against that, where people were saying, look, the fandom is a great fandom. They're highly supportive. They buy a lot of stuff. They support the fan. They've carried this on for many of them their entire lives. You shouldn't be attacking the fandom. But what I want to say is, it's one thing to come at it from a critical point of view, from a critical eye. I think Eckhart's Ladder did a fairly good job of it. I don't necessarily agree with him, but he came out to from a point of saying, to him, he wanted it executed better, and to him, it doesn't make a lot of sense, and so he's a little perturbed by it. I think that's fair. It's absolutely fair for a fan to come through it that way and to express it that way. And a lot of it's in how you express yourself. Where I see the fandom menace come through is they mock people, they insult people, and they come at it from a tearing it apart uh, uh, angle. And what I've seen are people who came out of the Rise of Skywalker who said they liked the movie. Afterward, through what has been happening through this negativity, is now they're saying, you know what, I don't think I liked it anymore. And so we're actually removing enjoyment from fans because of the way that they're expressing themselves. So, yeah, stories by Irish. Yeah, TFA was your favorite. Severely disappointed in The Last Jedi and dampened Trump. Yeah, so, you know, even myself, where I'm a huge fan of The Last Jedi, I acknowledge that in the novelization and in the movie, that they did not give any evidence of Palpatine being part of the story, and it then is a through line. Then The Last Jedi kind of fails its responsibility, right? I love The Last Jedi, absolutely adore it. I I am a huge fan. I watch it over and over again, and I find something to enjoy out of it every single time. But I can absolutely understand and accept the criticisms that people have to say that it failed its responsibility, or that it didn't carry through the through line well enough, or perhaps it didn't develop the characters in a way that you know our leads the way that it should, or even the legacy characters the way that it should. If you're going to present it that way, you need to do more work to support it. And I've heard that. And I can see the validity of those arguments, and that's fine. And I think that evidence would say that the Lucasfilm Story Group has heard that feedback. And the evidence of it, and again, it comes up as a criticism I've seen this week. The evidence is when they did the release of the Project Luminous with the High Republic, you see where they were having brainstorming sessions with all of the authors, all of the contributors that are going to be creating that content were brought together, and they fleshed this out a little bit stronger. And that's not to say that then Claudia Gray dictated to other people, here's how you're going to carry out your character. Or somebody dictated to Claudia Gray and said, here, Claudia, you have to do this. It's not, you know, them writing her story for her, but saying, here are the characters, and here, you know, what their motivations. Here's, they even talk about what is it that scares the Jedi? What's motivating the Jedi? What's the thing in the universe that's causing this disruption? Like, they have all of that kind of fleshed out, and now the stories are able to develop on it. That seems to be no, and I think this is a fair criticism. Why didn't you do that with the sequel trilogy? Why didn't you, with the sequel trilogy, flesh that out? And I'm willing to be a little more forgiving than I think some people are. I'm willing to say that's because they learned their lesson, right? They thought that they could do this thin line and let then like, here's our thin through line. And I think Palpatine was always a part of that. From, again, as I mentioned, from Aftermath through The Force Awakens, Last Jedi, and into the Rise of Skywalker, this was the through line that they intended to follow. It's just that they didn't hold the authors or the directors, you know, in this case, accountable enough to carry that through in a way that makes enough sense. And so the hope is now that going forward into the next phase of movies, that they'll continue this approach like they did with the Project Luminous, that they'll carry through this approach that says, okay, directors, we've got 2 or 3 or 5, who knows how many different directors. Here we're gonna flesh this out, right? We're gonna have this this story fleshed out. You can tell it in your own way, right? You can direct and lead it in your own way, but you have to deliver this story. And I've heard it described by Josh on the Den of Nerds as it's a MCU of Star Wars, and I also heard the Star Wars theory use that same, like it's a MCU of Star Wars. And by that, what they mean is that you'll have individual movies that focus on a particular character, like we did in the MCU with Spider-Man and Captain America and Iron Man. And then as those stories come together as a group, then it culminates in this, like with the Avengers movies, right? So it culminates in this climax that then pays off very, very well to all those stories. And what we think and what we hope and what kind of we're looking forward to is that Star Wars is going to learn from this, and they'll start carrying these out in that kind of way. They'll flesh out characters. And I see Irish, where you were looking forward to Finn discovering he was force sensitive and all this. Exactly. What if we had movies that focused on these characters better, rather than focusing on a trilogy, to say that we've got different characters being fleshed out, and then in those fleshing out of those characters, those different storylines that come together, we end up with then an overarching movie that brings them together and carries that out into a climax. And maybe that's 1 movie or 2 or 3, who knows? But as the story group develops those, right, we have a story that focuses on Rey and her journey that maybe encapsulates what we get through The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi together, right? This is just Rey's story, and it kind of follows her. We get another that follows with Finn and how he is turmoil through the First Order and the relationships he has, and he comes out and the kind of conflict that we get with the clones in the Clone Wars, that animated series, where those characters get personality and they really struggle with war. And so Finn, you're able to explore his character a lot deeper. And then, you keep following these along, and then build up into one movie that brings them together in this quest, right? All of a sudden, Rey is meeting Finn, who's meeting Poe, right? And they all come together. Yeah, like something in the MCU. So I think that's where we're headed. At least I see with a lot of people that's what they hope for. And for me, that's where criticism is paying off, where you get people say, well, we expected better. It's not tearing apart what it is you love by putting it down and trying to shred it, as a lot of the fandom menace come across to me. It's like they're trying to shred things because they are so disappointed and so angry with how the story was carried out. But it's more of a constructive criticism that says, hey, this idea with Palpatine being a clone, great, except how did that play out, right? We didn't see it played out very well at all through the movies, nor in the novelizations of the movies, which, again, what I kind of want to get to, like a novelization gives you the ability to flesh that out further and give it more context and, more enriching story, a broader story that allows you to explore that a lot more. And I really don't think that we got that. And the story group does need to be held accountable to some degree to say, you guys kind of botched this whole thing. The way that you ended it was good. I just want to reinforce, I love the sequels. Right? I absolutely adore them. The Last Jedi is fantastic. It's one of my favorites. But I absolutely understand the criticism, and as I see this start to come out, it's very evident that that through line wasn't fully fleshed out. The other part that has people kind of angry, and we'll see this probably uh, explored further, is that final scene with Rey and Ben. And what we're seeing there, the Reylos are in an uproar. Some of them fighting amongst themselves. I know that fighting's maybe not the right word, but they're bringing up complaints, and they're being critical of was this a romantic kiss that they shared? Was it a romance that they shared? What was this connection they had? And in the picture, right, where people are reading that page from the Rise of Skywalker novelization, and I think it's part of 2 pages, but in any event, where they're reading that, um, there's an argument on both sides where they're saying, "Oh, they're tearing apart Reylo. They subverted it. They're saying that it was a platonic kind of thing, not a romantic kind of thing." And there are people say, because there's a line in there that says something to the effect, and forgive me if I don't quote it correctly, but there's a line in there that says something to the effect of Rey never missed Kylo, that she didn't have any connection to Kylo, and she felt that he was, she doesn't have any connection to him at all, or feelings towards him. All of her attention and focus was on Ben, and only Ben. And this kiss that they shared was her and Ben, and that it was something to do with that connection. And I haven't followed all the passion that's involved with the Reylos around breaking that kiss down and what means what. I have seen some of them complain that the Kylo is actually part of Ben, and you can't separate those out distinctly, and for her not to acknowledge this and that, and it just starts a whole argument. And that's where I see the fandom, something that's disappointing to me. And as I like to say, fans, do better, right? Try to come together. And it's one thing when the Harry Potter fandom is really critical of the prequels, right? This stuff where the storylines don't add up, nothing fits together. McGonagall is one of the real good examples. Like, she's in the Grindelwald movies as a teacher, but the time setting of the Grindelwald movies, she shouldn't have even been born yet. How is it that she's a teacher? So there's plenty of continuity errors, right? That the fandom is really upset about, where just a general fan wouldn't be aware of it, and they just watch the movies. But that's because you have 2 different distinct kind of groups. So those that come from a novelization into the movies, and so they have this rich context, they have the full explanation, and so when there's something that happens in the movies that conflicts with those novels, it riles them up. But you have a fandom that's agreed to the novels as being the canon, right? And then the movies stray from that, and that's where they get upset. What the Lucasfilm Story Group is, they started with the movies, and they said everything is supposed to be canon, everything's supposed to fit together, we're not supposed to have any conflict. Irish, you don't think it was romantic, a happy relief, thank you. Yeah, I agree with you about, I'm sorry, I kind of rambling, but I agree with you that I didn't see the romance. I am not a Reylo per se, because I think Reylos say that connection between Rey and Kylo is a romantic one. And to be a Reylo, a true Reylo, you see that ship as a romance. For me, connections between characters like that don't have to be romantic. They can have a very strong connection. And I'll go back to the Lord of the Rings, for example. In the Lord of the Rings, Samwise and forgetting the guy that went along with him. They were very, very, very close. They shared a love for one another, a sacrificial love for one another, a bond between one another where they deeply, deeply cared for one another. But it didn't go into a romance, right? It wasn't a homosexual kind of relationship where they had a desire for each other romantically. But everything you see in the movies carried out, you see that that love for one another as a really, really deep love. And for me, in the movies, the Reylo thing to me has always been, well, Rey and Kylo definitely had this connection, or Rey and Ben had this connection that kept drawing them together. To me, it was the Force. It wasn't romance, and so that's for me. I didn't see it as a romance, and um, and there are Reylos exactly that are absolutely screaming at one another if you disagree with them or don't see it. And there are some Reylos that carry it out into, like, Adam Driver should leave his wife and family to be with. Uh, it just makes no sense. Like, why would an actor carry through? Because they see this connection, right? They see the connection played out on screen, and they just carry it way too far. Um, and I will say that there's perverted parts of the fandom that I've seen in the last few days that are disturbing, truly, truly disturbing. And it's that's why I say fans do better, right? Be better people, be better human beings. Um, some of the Reylo stuff is way out of hand. When you start making death threats towards Adam's wife, wanting her to die so that he'll be single and that he can, uh, uh, that's crazy. Why would you go that way? Be a better person. Be a better human being. Um, yeah, Keira Knightley and Orlando Bloom. Yeah, to me, um, I as a parent raising kids, and they come through and they watch a movie and they see a character die in a movie, or and they get really sad because they're like, oh, and I'd be, well, remember, this is a character we're seeing on film. This isn't that person. That person's still alive. They're fine. They weren't really hurt in this movie. They weren't really shot. They weren't really, dismembered. Those are all movie effects, and they're playing, and separating out the actor from the um, role is critical, and being able to follow that. So um, that's what I wanted to talk about today. I think it's good for the novelizations to exist. I think it's fine for a novelization to expand and flesh out a story. But what it shouldn't do, especially from the Lucasfilm story group, is it shouldn't uh, uh, conflict with anything we saw before. Um, as always, if there's something that you would like to discuss, I would love to interact with fans and talk about these things. Stories by Irish. It's great to have you here today, somebody to kind of bounce things off of. And if we could get more participation, I'd be willing to have somebody come on and we can bounce ideas off of one another, or even have disagreements that we kind of flesh out, and just kind of demonstrate how you can have different perspectives on things. You can have different wants and desires out of a story, but they don't have to result in an absolute throwdown between fans. And as you mentioned, Stories by Irish, as you mentioned, one of the storylines is about Finn, and we wanted a lot more about Finn. Where did he, what were his feelings? We didn't get that in the movies, and that's because they're constrained. They're constrained in scope and time, but in the novelizations, they can be explored. So, hey, we've got another, the two med to Star Wars. Hello there, Master Kenobi. Is that you? So anyway, that's, I know you're coming in here at the very end. I appreciate you guys being here. And as I've mentioned before, I've got Santa's mailbox back here, right behind me. If there's an idea that you would love for me to discuss, talk about myself, or talk about my beliefs or my thoughts about something, or a topic that you would just like to discuss further, send those to me. We'll put them in Santa's mailbox and pull them out for a future discussion. And yes, yeah, uh, this is great. I'm so happy to have you guys here, and we're going to wrap it up and call it a day. But we'll have some more of these discussions going forward. Until then, I just want to say, may the force be with you, and Merry Christmas, everybody. Bye bye. We'll catch you next time.